Hello, in this video I'm going to cover the game between Magnus Carlsen and Alexander Grischuk. After 3 rounds, Carlsen had 2 points. In the previous video you can see first 3 games, where he beat Gelfand in the round 3 and he drew against Kramnik and Aronian. And let's get to this game. He was white and he played e4, and Grischuk chose to play the Berlin in the Ruy Lopez. And now, of course, as you may know, white can choose to castle, and we have options like knight e4, and then you might get into some endgame after this, and knight f5, which leads to a well-known Berlin endgame, or you can do rook e1, which leads to a very dry position with symmetrical structure, somewhat looking like the Petrov. But Magnus does avoid this, and he plays d3. This is the anti-Berlin, and it leads to something that resembles of typical Ruy Lopez or Italian. Grischuk plays bishop c5 and now c3. c3, a very typical move for this opening, trying to take over control over d4, trying to push d4 at some point. But it's too soon because the e4 is not is very soft at the moment. Black is not afraid of d4 right now, and he castles, and now d6. The bishop will go back, or will go to g4, let's say, or just develop randomly on d7 or e6, but yeah, e6 is a bit problematic because of d4, d5 potential fork. Now Magnus plays h3, trying to limit this bishop, and also to stop bishop g4. Well, that's the same, but if white wants to push d4, bishop g4 would delay this in a great deal. And now Grischuk plays a6, which is begging to be captured, which is begging to ruin the pawn structure. There's also an option of knight e7, a very typical maneuver in these types of positions, to transfer the knight to g6, and that way to still keep an eye on e5, but to also get to g6 and control these squares f4 and h4. And the game can continue something like d4, bishop b6. Now e4 is loose, so capturing on e5 is not doing that much. After taking, you need to defend the e4, so you can go here, but after knight g6, this queen e7, black is doing fine, in my opinion. Or if you don't capture on e5, you can go rook e1, but in that case black manages to get knight g6 in time and defend this pawn, which still leads to a good position for black. I don't see a problem for him. But he chose this a6 move, which is challenging white. Does he want to go bishop a4, bishop c2 and play in the more Ruy Lopez fashion, or does he want to ruin the pawn structure of black, but give up the bishop pair? That's the question. And Magnus chose to accept this challenge and take on c6. Probably because if he goes bishop a4, he thought this was a loss of time and black would have b5 maybe and go bishop b7, and this, in my opinion, is not a huge concern for black. Maybe even h6 first would be played, just to avoid bishop g5. But yeah, he took on c6. After a6, we had this, and now rook e1. Magnus prepares d4 by defending this pawn on e4. And now black is trying to somehow counter this, to indirectly pressure on e4, to put pressure on e4. And that's why Magnus keeps defending this pawn as much as possible. Knight d2. But actually it was possible to push d4 here. And if you take, well, on the next move you go knight c3, if let's say bishop b6. I think after this white is slightly better, because at the moment bishop pair is not very relevant. The position is still not quite opened, and I think that pawn structure is much more relevant in this situation. If you somehow exchange the c6 for d4, then you might argue that the bishop pair can have some impact, but in this case it's not a big deal for white. So I think this is the better move, better choice. Bishop b6 in that case, in that hypothetical case. And this is something that caught my attention, exchanging queens and going knight a3. Because immediately if you take on e5, then black can take on e4, and you cannot capture because of this, and you take the bishop, and then the first rank is just pinned, and you cannot do much. So if you allow knight e4, white has to play this, but you can just take it. And again, rook e3 is not so good because of rook d1, and this whole thing is pinned on the first rank. So if you need to play fe, well, that's already a cause to be concerned. Now black can play c5, bishop b7, and these weak pawns are not very important for black, because this knight on b1 is actually really bad. If you move the knight to a3, then there might be some jump to d2. So it's not all that bright. So after this, I mentioned exchange of queens and knight a3, not capturing on e5, but now I think it's crucial to defend this pawn, and black has to play something like this, knight c4 and f6, and I think after rook d1, white is somewhat more pleasant. I think the engine doesn't give any advantage whatsoever, but in human eye, at least in my eye, this position feels better for white. But Magnus just tries to be not very forcing, and he goes knight bd2. And now Grischuk does something really concrete. He pushes d5, which is a bit dubious because it makes the pawn structure more unflexible. For example, if black tried just to go bishop b6, just to step away from out of the way of d4 push, yeah, and let's say if white tries knight f1, some h6 comes, I don't know, bishop e6, bishop e3, black can play even c5. At first, it might seem that it's blocking the bishop, and the bishop on b6 looks like a big pawn, but at the other glance, with c5 you're contesting for the d4 push, and also you don't want to give up the bishop pair. And this move might be useful because at every instance of d4 push for white, black will open up the position and it will suit his bishops much more than in this position, when you can also take on e3, but after c5 you already exchanged bishop pair, and it's not really that that dangerous if you open up the positions. Now with d4 there's only one bishop on the board, and I don't really know how. I think that white is better here, slightly better. But Grischuk plays d5, and the play becomes really interesting. Also, this move is quite reasonable because black is the one who has the bishop pair advantage, and he is striving to open it up, to open up the whole position, to make his bishops much more useful, and d5 in that sense makes lots of sense. In that sense makes lots of sense. And now Magnus just took on d5. Maybe d4 is also something that's interesting, but after d4, knight e5, you can go queen d5 to defend the pawn and use the fact that the knight on e5 is loose. The pawn on d4 is also overloaded, so you cannot capture the bishop. And also by queen d5 you defend the e4 pawn. And if, let's say, queen c2 happens, then you have bishop d6. And there is small tactic here because you cannot capture like this because of f6 in the end, and because the rook on e4 is loose, you cannot move the knight, and you lose the knight. But yeah, after d5, this move looked very logical, just to open up and to use some of these weaknesses, especially e5. Queen d5, very logical because you want to defend the pawn on e5, and now knight b3. Just you want to defend the d3 pawn, and now bishop f8. The other option is going to a7 and pushing, after bishop e3, pushing c5, but I really don't like it. It just seems so ugly. So he went for bishop f8 and now c4. Trying to get more space and trying to dislodge this queen from a very comfy square on d5, and trying to get it on d6 because it's the only square where it can continue defending the e5 pawn. Now bishop e3. I guess he wants to try bishop c5 and to exchange bishops, because if you exchange bishops as white, it's already a small success because black will not have the bishop pair advantage. So that's why Grischuk plays knight d7, tries to stop bishop c5. And now, using the fact that the knight is not in the center anymore, Magnus pushed d4, but now Grischuk avoids the exchange and tries to block the center, because if he takes on d4 with bishop d4, the bishop becomes a dominant piece in the position. You can also take with the knight, I don't know, maybe even like this, and jump to f5 or queen f3 next. So by e4, black is just trying not to activate white's pieces even more. And this is much better version because white's pieces are not really that dangerous at the moment. They don't even cross the fourth rank. And now how does black continue here? How does he improve his pieces? Well, first he begins with a5, trying to put some pressure on this knight on b3, trying to push it with a4 to a much passive square to c1. So that's why Magnus was not forced, but provoked to play a4. But also this move has its drawbacks, because after a4 the b3 knight becomes much looser because there's no protection by the pawn. But also with this move a4, he's fixing the a5 pawn, and it might become a weakness later on in the game when some pieces come off the board. Let's say if the bishop goes to d2, it will attack on a5, or queen d2, knight can capture on a5. So it's very, very double-edged. It might turn both ways. And now Grischuk plays f5, tries to create something on the king side. Tries to push f4 next, and to actually trap this bishop on e3. And that's why Magnus plays c5, and this is the critical moment of the game. This is where the game becomes how to say it, this is where the game turns around, and Grischuk plays queen g6. But here actually it was necessary to stop knight c4 and to play queen e6, because once you allow knight c4, a5 hangs. And if white tries to attack the c7 pawn by bishop f4, now black doesn't even need to defend it. He can just go knight f6, and in case of bishop c7, to just go queen f7 and bishop e6, and black would have a decent compensation for this pawn, because he's gonna have a nice outpost on d5 for, I guess, his bishop even, because you want to push f4 and you need to defend the e4 pawn in that case. And even if you take on a5, I think you can just go bishop e6 and let's say bishop c3 to just bring back the bishop. You can go here and start pushing these pawns, push this avalanche of pawns, and have a good chance to generate some counterattack on the king side. So after c5, queen e6 was necessary to just stop knight c4. And also, I think after this move is also possible, why not? Although it loses some time, but if you're so afraid of this, you can do that, and then continue knight f6, knight d5, and do the same thing. But Grischuk plays queen g6, which allows knight c4, and things become very concrete. White is going to capture an a5, but is black going to be quick enough to generate some play? Well, we're gonna see. Knight f6, and first, now white doesn't hurry with capture on a5, because first he needs to sort out some stuff on the king side, because if you just go too quickly with things, black will push f4 at some point, knight d5, f4, and blitz you on the king side. Let's say if you take on a5 like this, knight d5, queen d2, and well, now I'm thinking about rook a5, but you can simply capture it, and if f4, then you can take it, and in case of this, just bishop g3 exists. And e3 is, I think, not good enough, because you can give back some material, and after this to just capture the bishop. Probably it was possible to capture an a5, but Magnus was being so cautious, and first he chose bishop f4. Now Grischuk does the same, knight e5, and now queen d2. The point of this is not to allow the bishop to become active by some f4 push. And now if black takes on f4, takes bishop e6, you can take on a5, and what do? Your pawns just hang. And if bishop d5, just to prepare at some moment f4, you can go b4, and in case of this, to just jump back. And because of b4 now, this is so safe to play, knight e3. So Grischuk plays bishop e6 here. And now it's time to capture this pawn. You see this bishop pair, but it's not very useful at all. Bishop on f8 is dead. Bishop on e6 is still not fully used. And this was the moment that Grischuk had to make things... how to say it, to make them more bearable. And he played rook eb8, which was a huge mistake. It was better just to take on f4. And if queen takes, queen f6, to attack this pawn, and now white can take on c7, but things become slightly complicated, because after rook e8 he goes back queen d4. These pawns are not so stable anymore, and c5 will drop. The only line for white which works is knight b6. And now black can take on c5, knight c8, you can take it, and white cannot keep his extra exchange, because after knight e6 there is queen b4, I suppose, and the knight gets trapped. Or you just lose the b2 pawn. And what happens now? Rook e d1, bishop b3. You don't have any squares for the rook, so you have to give up the exchange either by knight f5 or just by this move. And if black captures, there is this. And now because of some checkmate like knight f7, knight h6, you cannot go king h8, because this is just dead lost in a few moves. So black has to go here, after which takes, knight f5, and white is still slightly better because, of course, of these two pawns on the queen side, but I'm not very sure that it's gonna be enough, because they're very unflexible pawns. It reminds me a bit of the Banco structure and their problems when they try to push. But anyways, it was the best chance for Grischuk, and he chose rook eb8, after which Magnus played knight e5, double attacking on c6, queen f6, and now maybe he was a bit afraid of capturing immediately on c6, because after this, queen takes. Here it's not possible to go knight b8 because of queen g5, and suddenly there are some issues because of dual threats, queen g2 or knight h3, losing the queen. So queen takes f4 is a must, rook b2, and maybe he was afraid of bishop d5, losing the knight. But actually, it was possible to save this knight by pushing a5, or just queen c1. Queen c1 immediately, and after this to just push. Because now after this, after bishop d5, there is rook b1. Rook b1, and if you exchange and then take on c6, there is this check. And you cannot go to h8 because of this, and some small issue with this checkmate. So actually, after queen b1, the knight is going to go back home, or just queen b7 next. And that way, white is going to preserve his material and keep the game pretty much in the control. But he chose to go back to h2, which wasn't the best move, but it still kept some control. And now Grischuk plays a very, very interesting idea, which doesn't work in the end. Spoilers, some small spoilers, but nevertheless, it was a very interesting shot. He took on a5. I don't know how he could continue fighting here. Maybe knight b4. But actually you take on c6 anyways, and it's tough to suggest anything at all for him. He tried something to just muddy the waters and to get some attack on the king side. But after queen takes, rook b2, now rook a b1. Now black's issue is that he doesn't have many pieces in the attack. His only active piece is the rook, and it's gonna get harassed by rooks, by white rooks. So logically enough, he tries to avoid this trade and goes rook a2. And now queen a6. The purpose of this move is double. He wants to attack on c6 and also to bring his queen back to f1 to defend if possible, against some e3, fe3, queen g5 ideas, to have queen f1 back and to defend g2. So Grischuk plays his idea, e3, fe, and now queen g5. Of course, now queen f1 is not possible because of some knight e3 and losing the material. Rook g2 comes next, or just you have to give up some material back, but actually this will be quite ugly. So he chose to play this, rook e2. Much better to cover the second rank. And yeah, also to defend the g2, why not? Black plays this move. And I guess now you can, well, it's not very clear. You cannot just take on a2 because of bishop a2, and there are some issues because you have to play rook a2. I don't like this very much. Bishop d5 comes next. This is very, very tough. And there's so many attackers on g2, so I would not consider this. And Magnus just plays knight f3, just being very cool and collected, and he plays this. Grischuk has to keep some pressure on g2, so he plays queen g6, and now it's time for this move. Because at this moment, now he buys some time. He doesn't allow bishop d5 to be so lethal, like in the previous case. And yeah, in case of bishop d5, now you can go queen e2 and defend basically everything. f3, g2, and also attack e3. Get some very crucial tempo on the knight. So Grischuk plays bishop c4, tries to attack with some tempi. queen a5, and now after bishop d5, it seems like white is getting in some trouble because the knight is under attack and the g2 might be under some slight pressure, but Magnus finds a really nice resource, queen e1 again, defending in a very clever way, trying to bring his queen back to defense before things become unpleasant. And now, if the knight goes back, let's say here, then you can just afford to play rook f2 and defend the knight. So Grischuk plays f4, tries to keep some pressure, but Magnus takes. Knight c2. And after queen f2, now this knight is under lots of pressure and it can jump to a3, but you don't really have any options after knight e5, and the knight is just on the rim, and you know what they say about the knights on the rim. So black chose to capture, but after rook c2 there was not enough firepower in the game, and with only bishop and queen in the game, the bishop on f8 is just a dead piece. Black resigned, and which was understandable because there's also a pawn which is going to be very dangerous. And that's how it ended. In this position, Grischuk resigned, and Magnus went to have 3 points after 4 rounds. And in the next video, I'm going to show you the games between against Ivanchuk in the round 5 and also against Svidler in round 6. So stay tuned for more videos.